Well, good morning, class. Welcome back to Life of Christ, and we are going to jump right in this morning. And we are going to spend our time talking and thinking about the marching orders that Christ gave to his church. And as you can see, as I have this subtitled, we're really going to be talking and thinking together about King Jesus and his authority and then his commission. Let me just say at the front end, we're going to be focusing on Matthew 28, as it says in your syllabus in just a moment. We're going to sort of look at an exegetical, or take an exegetical look at that section of the gospel, and then try to make some application and think through these things as we're quickly wrapping up the end of our course and our time together thinking about Jesus. We're going to slowly be sort of transitioning from sort of the account of the gospel to what all of this has to do today for the individual follower of Jesus, and then for the local church at a local church level, what Jesus means and looks like, and how he and his words get fleshed out. And so I want to begin, as we're thinking about the marching orders, by noting that as Jesus himself says, or as it's recorded for us in Matthew's gospel, that all authority in heaven and on earth, that's a cosmic and global authority. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Jesus. And as the Lord, as the one who exercises authority cosmically and globally, what Jesus does is issue marching orders. And so what are those marching orders? Well, let's look. Let me find the document here. Here we go. This is the so-called Great Commission text. And I want you to make note. I'll read it and then we'll highlight a couple of things here. Now, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, that is, when the disciples had saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. So the question in front of us, and the question that every Christian and every church needs to wrestle with, is this question: what are King Jesus's marching orders? And I'm giving you a little, or at least tipping my hand, so to speak, by sharing the screen with you. What I want you to see is that the make disciples, which is in red, I've got it highlighted for you in red. In the Greek text, that is actually just one verb. It's one verb. And in this little section, it's the only imperative. Now, an imperative is the command. So in this case, it's the one main command. So if we're going to step back from Matthew 28, 16, and 20 and ask the question, what is Jesus telling the church to do? What's the command? What's the imperative? The answer is in red: make disciples. That is to be the overarching aim, goal, mission, purpose of the local church. Make disciples. Now, we'll come back to this in a moment, so bear with me here. Let me go back. Here we go. Okay, so I just want to make sure that you have that square in your mind. The very first, or the only marching orders that Jesus gives, is to make disciples. Now, we're going to shift gears real quick. We're going to come back to what that looks like in a moment. But before we do, I want us to think, well, what is a disciple? It's one thing to say, or it's one thing to recognize that Jesus calls the church to make disciples. It's another thing to ask the question, well, what is a disciple? And a disciple, this is a definition that I think is specific enough to be useful, but it's broad enough where my hope is that, all churches and all Christians would be able to sort of grab onto it. So here's how I define a disciple, and I think this is like I said, a specific and yet broad way that the New Testament would speak of it. A disciple is one whose entire life is being transformed by the gospel of Jesus. Okay, so who is a disciple? A disciple is one whose entire life is being transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when I say entire life, the gospels and the epistles of the New Testament, they're going to emphasize the head, the heart, and the hands. So a disciple is one whose head is being transformed, whose heart is being transformed, whose hands are being transformed. And I just use that alliteration for the sake of it being handy. What I mean by head is the mind, the way that we think. This is the whole point of Jesus's teaching and these things, right? So that we would understand, right? What does 2 Peter 3:18 say? But grow in the grace and knowledge, right? So a disciple is one whose head is affected by these things, right? But it's not just our head. We want to avoid intellectualism. And so we have to recognize the gospel has to go from the head south 18 inches to the heart. Our affections, our loves, the way that we feel, right? We're to adore Jesus. We're to love Jesus. We're not just to have a cold, dead, rigid intellectualism and then a small, shallow, cold heart. No. Nor are we to have big hearts and tiny little heads, right? One is intellectualism, the other is emotionalism. Both are bad. We want to have heads and hearts that are being transformed by the gospel so that the things that I think about God and the way that I feel about God, these are both being impacted. And then finally, this has to work itself out into our hands, right? How we love one another, how we serve one another, how we engage one another, how we treat our neighbors, our coworkers, our family, our loved ones, our community, the way that we give of our time and treasure and talents. This is all in submission to and in service of King Jesus. So again, to be redundant, a disciple is not one who's just really smart. A disciple is not one that's just got ooey gooey feelings all the time. And a disciple is not one who simply, spends every weekend, volunteering at some homeless shelter. Those are all good things and can be, don't get me wrong. But a disciple, biblically speaking, is one whose entire life is being transformed. Head, heart, and hands. You can't do one and leave the other undone. Okay, so with that, I want to return to this screen here and ask the question, okay, well, how do we do that? If we understand now that Jesus wants the church to make disciples, and if we understand what a disciple is, then we're going to ask the question, well, how do we do that? And Jesus tells us how to do that. He gives us the directions. He says there in verse 19, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on the grammar of this, except to say this. The imperative, which I've highlighted for you in red, is to make disciples. What the text shows us is three participles, and I've highlighted those in green for you. And what the participles do is modify the imperative. This is one of the ways that participles work in the Greek language, and it's also how they work in the English language. One of the functions of a participle is to explain how the imperative is done, okay? So when we say, well, we're supposed to make disciples, how we make disciples, Jesus tells us, we go, we baptize, and we teach. We go, we baptize, and we teach. That is how disciples are made. Or as I've put down here in italics, we make disciples by going, by baptizing, and by teaching. So this is the job of the church, okay? Make disciples. How? Church by going, church by baptizing, and church by teaching. That's how the church makes, that's how the church makes disciples. Okay. So carrying out these marching orders, we go, we baptize, we teach. What does that mean? Well, let me just make a couple of comments and then we'll wrap up. First of all, when it comes to going, that first participle, the church is called not to stay, but to go. There's an important sort of redemptive historical shift from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. This is not original to me. It's been said that under the Old Covenant, the people of God were sort of a come and see religion. But under the New Covenant, the people of God are now a go and tell religion. Okay, so we need to understand that the church does not make disciples by drawing the shades, locking the door, and enjoying our little holy huddles. The church has to go. It has to go not only to the other side of the world where the gospel is not yet gone, but the church, to make disciples, also must go across the street, right, to our neighbor's house. The church has to mobilize and go. That's how disciples are made. Also, the church must baptize. Historically, and I think accurately so, the church has recognized that baptism is the initiation rite into the church. We might say that baptism is the front door of the household of faith. So that when a convert is baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit into the name of the triune God, what God is doing is identifying this person as his own son or his own daughter. And so the church goes, and then the church baptizes, and in other words, it initiates people into the Christian religion upon faith, and then the church teaches. The church teaches. As Jesus said in the text that we just looked at, all that I've commanded you. Disciples are not simply converts. Making a convert is step one. What disciples are lifelong learners of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done and what that means for how they're going to live their life. And so a little phrase that we use in my congregation is that we want to grow in our knowledge of God, our love for God, and our obedience to God. Okay? That's what I said. Knowledge of God, love for God, obedience to God. And so this is how the church is to carry out Jesus's marching orders. We go and we baptize and we teach. So to put a pin in it, what is the mission of the church? Friends, the mission of the church is to go and make disciples. All that you and I have been talking about for the last couple of months, from the incarnation to the life, to the death, to the burial, to the resurrection, to the ascension of Jesus. We, as individual Christians and as church members and as local churches, we are to be heralding this message, going, baptizing, and teaching, so that those from every tribe and tongue and language and people would bow the knee before King Jesus. I pray that you would be encouraged. I'll talk to you guys next time.